The ocean stretches in every direction, gray, cold, endless. Beneath its surface, a German U-boat commander adjusts his periscope, scanning the horizon for the silhouette of a lone merchant vessel. For 3 years, this has been the mathematics of survival. Find the convoy, strike from below, vanish into the deep. The Atlantic had been theirs, a hunting ground measured in tonnages sunk, in Allied sailors lost, in the slow strangulation of Britain's supply lines. But in the spring of 1943, something changes. The convoys no longer scatter, the sky is no longer empty, and the ocean, once a sanctuary, begins to feel like a trap. The U-boat war had been Germany's greatest strategic advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic, a campaign that Winston Churchill would later call the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the entire war. From 1940 through early 1943, German submarines operated with devastating effectiveness, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping and threatening to sever the lifeline between North America and Britain. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet grew from fewer than 60 operational boats in 1940 to nearly 400 by 1943. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, perfected the wolf pack tactics that allowed submarines to coordinate attacks on convoys, overwhelming escort defenses through sheer numbers and night surface assaults. The statistics were staggering. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. The British Isles, dependent on imports for nearly everything from food to fuel, faced the real possibility of starvation and strategic collapse. For German submariners, the Atlantic was a place of opportunity and professional pride. They were the elite, volunteers who endured claustrophobic conditions, constant danger, and the knowledge that their survival odds were slim. Yet, through 1942, those odds seemed better than they would become.
Then came 1943, and within a span of weeks in May, the entire calculus of the U-boat war reversed. The German submariners who departed their bases in Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire in the spring of 1943 expected another hunting season. They had reason to be confident. Despite losses, U-boat production continued to outpace sinkings. New crews were trained, new technologies were being introduced, and the Allied convoys still had to cross 3,000 miles of open ocean. But what those crews encountered in May 1943 was not the Atlantic they had known. It was an ocean that had learned to see in the dark. The transformation began not with a single invention, but with a convergence of technologies and tactical adaptations that closed the gaps through which U-boats had slipped for years. The most critical of these was the extension of Allied air cover across the entire Atlantic. For years, there had existed a region in the mid-Atlantic, roughly between Greenland, Iceland, and the Azores, where convoys sailed beyond the range of land-based aircraft. This black gap, or air gap, had been the U-boats' sanctuary, a zone where they could operate on the surface with relative impunity, recharging batteries, making high-speed transits, and coordinating attacks without fear of sudden air assault. By early 1943, that gap was closing. The introduction of very long-range aircraft, modified B-24 Liberators capable of flying over 2,000 miles, meant that convoys could receive air escort throughout their entire journey. These aircraft carried depth charges, radar, and the ability to force U-boats to submerge, reducing their speed and effectiveness. A U-boat on the surface could make 17 knots. Submerged, it crawled at 7. That difference was everything. But air power alone was not sufficient. The real weapon was information, the ability to see, track, and target submarines before they could strike. Centimetric radar, operating on a wavelength of 10 centimeters, became operational in Allied aircraft and escort vessels in early 1943. Unlike the older metric radar, which U-boats could detect with their warning receivers, centimetric radar was invisible to German detection equipment. A surfaced U-boat running at night to recharge its batteries had no warning that an aircraft was closing in until it was too late. The ocean's darkness, once a shield, became a liability.
Equally transformative was the refinement of high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, known colloquially as Huff-Duff. German U-boats communicated frequently with headquarters and with each other, coordinating wolf pack attacks through radio transmissions. HFDF allowed Allied escort groups to triangulate the source of these transmissions and vector aircraft or surface ships toward the submarine's position. A U-boat commander reporting a convoy sighting was, unknowingly, broadcasting his own location. Escort groups themselves evolved. By 1943, the Allies had created specialized support groups, flotillas of destroyers, frigates, and corvettes that were not tied to specific convoys but roved the Atlantic, responding rapidly to U-boat concentrations. These groups were equipped with forward-throwing depth-charge weapons like Hedgehog, which allowed them to maintain sonar contact while attacking, rather than losing it during the final approach, as with traditional stern-dropped charges. The convoy escorts also benefited from increased numbers. Britain's shipyards and those of Canada and the United States were producing escorts faster than U-boats could sink them. And then there was intelligence. The code breakers at Bletchley Park had been reading German naval Enigma traffic intermittently since 1941, but by mid-1942, a temporary blackout occurred when the Germans introduced a fourth rotor to their naval Enigma machines. For nearly a year, Allied intelligence was partially blind. But by December 1942, the four-rotor Enigma was broken, and by early 1943, the flow of decrypted U-boat traffic resumed. The Allies could read Dönitz's orders, know where wolf packs were forming, and reroute convoys away from danger, or, when circumstances allowed, direct support groups directly into the path of a concentrating U-boat force. None of these developments alone would have ended Germany's U-boat advantage. Together, they created a system, an integrated anti-submarine warfare network that turned the Atlantic into an environment where U-boats could no longer operate with impunity. The men aboard those U-boats in May 1943 did not understand this immediately. They knew in the abstract that the war was becoming harder. They heard reports of increased losses, of comrades who did not return. But human psychology resists systemic realization. Each crew believed their skill, their caution, their commander's experience would be enough. They had been taught that the U-boat was Germany's answer to Allied industrial power, that a single submarine, costing a fraction of a battleship, could sink 10 times its value in enemy tonnages. The mathematics, they believed, favored them. But mathematics had changed. In the first 20 days of May 1943, 31 U-boats were sunk. In a single month, the Kriegsmarine lost more submarines than in any comparable period of the war. The loss rate, which had hovered around 10% through 1942, spiked to over 30% in May 1943. For context, a 10% loss rate per patrol meant that a submariner had roughly a 50% chance of surviving 10 patrols. At 30%, survival odds collapsed. The U-boat service, which had been a dangerous but viable profession, became a near-certain death sentence. The experience of those crews was one of disorientation and mounting dread. A U-boat would surface at night, as it had done 1,000 times before, to recharge batteries and ventilate the fetid air below. The watch officer would scan the horizon with binoculars, seeing only darkness and the low swells of the Atlantic. Then, without warning, the sky would ignite. Flares dropped from an aircraft they had neither seen nor heard. Seconds later, depth charges, or worse, the direct strafing fire of aircraft machine guns. The alarm bell would sound, the crew would scramble below, the vents would slam shut, and the boat would crash dive, dropping as fast as ballast tanks could flood. But a crash dive took 30 seconds, and an aircraft traveling at 200 miles per hour could cross a mile in 18 seconds. Many boats never made it.
Those that survived the initial attack faced a new ordeal. Escort ships, summoned by the aircraft or alerted by HFDF, would arrive and hold contact. The destroyer's sonar would ping through the hull, a sound every submariner learned to dread. Then the depth charges would begin. Modern depth charges, set with more accurate detonation depths, would bracket the submarine, and even a near miss could rupture hull seams, shatter gauges, crack battery casings, and release chlorine gas, or jam diving planes. A U-boat forced to surface by damage faced immediate destruction. Surrender was rare. Most crews were killed by gunfire before they could abandon ship. There are records, fragmentary, terse, compiled from Allied reports and the few German survivors, of what those final moments were like. Oberleutnant zur See Peter Dönitz, son of the Admiral, was killed in May 1943 when his boat U-954 was sunk by a British destroyer in the North Atlantic. The boat was detected by radar, attacked by depth charges, forced to the surface, and destroyed by gunfire. No one survived. Kapitänleutnant Siegfried von Forstner, commander of U-402, survived his boat's sinking in October 1943 and later described the experience of being hunted by aircraft and surface ships as one of helplessness. The crew could do nothing but wait, deep and silent, hoping the pinging would fade, knowing that each explosion brought the odds of survival lower. The German Navy recorded these losses with characteristic precision. Each boat that failed to return was listed, its crew memorialized, its fate investigated when possible. By June 1943, the evidence was undeniable. Admiral Dönitz, confronted with casualty reports and operational failures, made a decision that amounted to an admission of defeat. He withdrew the U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The order came on May 24, 1943. For the first time since the war began, the Atlantic was effectively conceded. This was not a formal surrender, not a signed treaty. It was a strategic retreat born of necessity. Dönitz justified the decision by arguing that losses had become unsustainable and that new technologies, acoustic torpedoes, improved anti-aircraft armament, snorkel devices to allow submerged diesel operation, would restore the U-boat's effectiveness. Some of these technologies did eventually arrive, but none reversed the underlying shift. The Allies had industrialized anti-submarine warfare. Every U-boat sunk was replaced by new escorts, new aircraft, better training, refined tactics. The symbolic weight of this moment is difficult to overstate. The U-boat had been more than a weapon. It had been a symbol of German asymmetric power, proof that a smaller, resource-constrained nation could challenge a global coalition through ingenuity and aggression. The U-boat crews were volunteers, often ideologically committed, drawn from the most technically proficient ranks of the Kriegsmarine. They saw themselves as a vanguard, carrying the fight to the enemy in the one domain where Germany could still contest Allied dominance. To lose that advantage was to lose more than tonnages and tactics. It was to lose a narrative. One element recurs throughout the accounts of this period, mentioned in diaries, in operational reports, in post-war interviews: coffee.
German U-boats, operating for weeks at a time in the Atlantic, relied on carefully rationed supplies. Fresh food spoiled within days, bread grew moldy in the humidity, but coffee remained, brewed strong, served hot, a small ritual that marked the boundary between one watch and the next, one day and another. It was a taste of normalcy in an environment that was anything but. Allied convoys, by contrast, were resupplied constantly. Escort vessels pulled into ports in Newfoundland, Iceland, Londonderry, and returned to sea with full stores. Merchant sailors, when they made it to port, found canteens stocked with goods that German civilians had not seen in years. This was not luxury, it was logistics. Coffee, in this context, became a symbol, not of comfort, but of endurance, not of abundance, but of a system that could sustain itself across oceans and years.
German submariners, pulling into French bases after increasingly harrowing patrols, found the contrast jarring. The bases themselves were heavily fortified, protected by massive concrete U-boat pens that could withstand Allied bombing. But inside those pens, the boats returned damaged, the crews exhausted, and the knowledge spreading that the next patrol might be the last. There was still coffee, still rations, still the routines of maintenance and repair, but the belief that they were winning, that their sacrifices served an achievable strategic goal, began to erode. The transformation was not immediate for everyone. Some commanders, particularly the veterans, adapted. They became more cautious, avoiding convoys when possible, targeting isolated ships, retreating at the first sign of air or surface threat. This extended their survival, but it also reduced their effectiveness. A cautious U-boat was a survivable U-boat, but it was not a victorious one. Dönitz continued to send boats into the Atlantic, shifting focus to areas with less air coverage, experimenting with new formations and technologies. But the fundamental reality did not change. The Allies could afford losses. Germany could not. By late 1943, U-boat crews departing on patrol knew the statistics. They knew that more than half the men who had served in U-boats since 1939 were already dead. They knew that the odds of completing even a single patrol successfully were no longer favorable. Yet they went, some out of duty, some out of ideology, some because there was no alternative. The German military did not permit resignation. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic in May 1943 was not the end of the U-boat threat. Submarines continued to operate, continued to sink ships, continued to tie down Allied resources. German engineers developed the Type 21 U-boat, a revolutionary design with higher submerged speed and endurance, but it arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. The war continued for 2 more years, and U-boats would claim more victims, but after May 1943, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Atlantic had become an Allied highway, and the submarines that once prowled it freely were now fugitives. There is a moment captured in the post-war testimony of surviving U-boat officers and encapsulates the psychological shift. A commander, whose name is now lost to history, described returning to base after a patrol in late 1943. His boat had been attacked repeatedly, had spent days submerged, had exhausted its battery reserves, and surfaced only at night, always listening for the sound of aircraft engines. They had not sunk a single ship. As they entered the harbor, the crew stood on deck, haggard, silent. The base commander greeted them, asked for a report. The U-boat commander, according to the account, simply said, "We are still here." Not victorious, not successful, just still alive. That, by the end of 1943, had become the measure of a successful patrol.
The broader implications of the Atlantic's reversal in 1943 extended far beyond the submarines themselves. The security of the convoy routes allowed the United States to transport millions of tons of equipment, fuel, food, and eventually soldiers to Britain in preparation for the invasion of Europe. Without secure Atlantic crossings, D-Day would have been impossible. The strategic bombing campaign, which required enormous quantities of fuel and munitions delivered by sea, would have been unsustainable. The Soviet Union, fighting desperately on the Eastern Front, received critical supplies through Arctic convoys that, while still dangerous, were no longer at the mercy of concentrated U-boat wolf packs. The entire Allied strategy, economic, military, logistical, depended on keeping the Atlantic open. May 1943 ensured that they could.
For Germany, the collapse of the U-boat offensive marked a point of no return. The Kriegsmarine had staked its relevance on submarine warfare. Without it, the German Navy was reduced to a peripheral role. Resources that might have been devoted to other priorities, air defense, armored production, fortifications, continued to flow into U-boat construction, chasing a hope that had already been lost. It was, in many ways, a microcosm of the larger German war effort by 1943, tactically proficient, operationally determined, but strategically doomed. The U-boat crews themselves, those who survived, carried the knowledge of this turning point for the rest of their lives. In post-war Germany, they were neither widely celebrated nor universally condemned. The U-boat service had fought, by most accounts, within the conventions of naval warfare. There were abuses, but fewer than in other branches of the Wehrmacht. Yet their service had been in the cause of a regime whose broader crimes were undeniable. The submariners occupied an uncomfortable space in historical memory. Professionals who had performed their duty with skill and courage in service of a fundamentally unjust cause. What remains, decades later, is the historical fact of their defeat. The U-boat war was, for a time, Germany's best answer to Allied industrial and demographic superiority. It failed, not because of a lack of courage, not because of incompetence, but because the system it opposed adapted, innovated, and overwhelmed it. The Allies learned faster, produced more, coordinated better. They turned the Atlantic from a contested space into a controlled one, and in doing so, they ensured that the war's outcome would be decided not at sea, but on the fields and in the cities of Europe. The ocean, in the end, is neutral. It does not favor the bold or the cautious, the ideologue or the pragmatist. It simply exists, vast and indifferent. What happened in 1943 was not the ocean's judgment, but history's. The advantage that Germany's U-boats had once possessed, born of surprise, of tactical innovation, of temporary technological parity, was extinguished by a combination of science, strategy, and industrial capacity. The submariners, brave and skilled as they were, found themselves on the losing side of that equation. There's a photograph taken sometime in late 1943 of a German U-boat returning to base. The crew is visible on deck, faces shadowed, expressions unreadable. In the foreground, one man holds a tin cup, likely coffee, brewed below and brought up to the bridge. The image is grainy, the details unclear, but the symbolism lingers. That cup of coffee, that small human comfort, represents continuity in the face of overwhelming change. It is a reminder that wars are fought by individuals, even when those individuals are caught in forces they cannot control. By the spring of 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic was over in all but name. U-boats still sailed, still attacked, still died, but they no longer threatened Allied victory. The convoys crossed, the supplies arrived, and the invasion of Europe proceeded on schedule. The U-boat, once the terror of the Atlantic, became a footnote, a threat to be managed, not a crisis to be feared. And the men who had sailed those boats, those who survived, returned to a Germany that was collapsing. They found their bases bombed, their families displaced, their nation on the verge of defeat. The Atlantic, which they had once believed they could control, had returned to what it always was, not a battlefield to be won, but a passage to be crossed. And in 1943, the Allies crossed it, in numbers that could not be stopped, with a certainty that could not be shaken. The coffee went cold, as it always does, but the war continued, and the outcome, by then, was no longer in doubt.